Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. I am joined once again by the magical, mystical Amy Hollenkamp, RD. I'm
Hello,
trying to
everybody.
give you like jazz fingers or something, or sparkle fingers right now, and I don't know if it's working.
It's working.
Okay. Well, I'm Nikki, because again, I forget to introduce myself half the time. Right out the get-go, let's share Instagram. You are found at
Amy_Hollenkamp_RD.
correct. And I'm at gut.microbiome.queen on Instagram. Welcome to the show. Oh, I didn't fully plan how I was going to lead into this episode because
I feel like
a doozy.
it could be from your end. So just to preface this, Nikki went on a tear from a research standpoint on the breath test, and she has done it again, folks. And I had the privilege to get some of her videos prior to posting, right?
Prior to release.
Because you only posted one, right, so far?
Not even actually as of the recording of this episode. So we're recording this right at the tail end of March. The first video goes live on my YouTube channel tomorrow. So you got it pre-release before anybody has seen it.
Funny story. So I'm on your email list, and sometimes when you send me personal emails, I confuse the two. And so it was funny when you sent the email with the videos for me to watch to prep for this episode. I think you said, "Hey, Foxy Lady," and I thought it was an email list. I thought it was an email list blast, and I was like, "How does she know?" And then I realized, oh, it's a personal. It was like a 5-second laugh, thinking, did she blast this out to her followers saying, "Hey, Foxy Lady"?
I should do that on my next one, just to see if you read it, or I should do something even weirder than that. See, this is the kind of gem content you can look forward to if you're on my email list. Also, how are you on my email list? That's so funny. Like,
I don't know
why or how.
I mean, I obviously probably signed in or something, or subscribed at some point.
That's so funny.
But again, I was like, oh, another email coming out, and then I saw in the preview or whatever, like, "Dear Foxy Lady," and I was like, whoa, seems intense for a subscriber-based email, but I'm here for it. So then I clicked on it and realized that it was not a subscriber email. It was a personal email to me.
Nope. Super secret email with those videos just for you. Just so we could have this conversation here and now. And that being said, there's a buttload of research on this topic, and I won't be able to recite all of the PubMed IDs and the article titles and the specific numbers for everything. If you want that level of data, go check out the YouTube videos, because I actually put it into PowerPoint format so that you could see the articles and the quotes of the PubMed ID, and we could go through it really thoroughly. But we're going to have a little bit more of a conversation about it here. So first off, I want to start out with two kind of historical things to frame this conversation. Well, first of all, let's just acknowledge that the way that most people are getting diagnosed with SIBO is from breath testing. So you ingest a sugar substrate, and then you collect breath samples, usually for 2 to 3 hours, and then you're looking for a peak in gas production before a certain timestamp. And if it's before a certain timestamp, we would say that's small intestine fermentation. And if it's after that timestamp, it's colon, right? Mm-hmm. That's probably how the majority of you have come to the SIBO kind of diagnosis. A smaller minority of you, but some of you still, have had a aspirate and culture test. And that is still considered to be the gold standard. But I'm going to put that kind of in air quotes. It's the gold standard, but it's more bronze, in my opinion.
Right.
There's a few issues with it. And the big thing that I think gets talked about the most with aspirate testing is that it's going to be highly dependent on the location that you sample from. Mm-hmm. So the small intestines are like 28 feet long. It's something ludicrously long. And you can't possibly sample from every single site of the small intestine. It's just not possible. So the doctor doing the aspirate is kind of doing an eeny, meeny, miny, mo of sorts, and they're just picking one location or two locations to sample from to get that aspirate. But say you had SIBO, but the pocket of overgrowth was isolated 10 feet away from where they happened to sample, right? So I think that there's this idea that aspirate testing probably results in false negatives because you can't possibly sample the entire intestine. As a side note, they are currently developing and researching gas sensing capsules, which would do exactly that. They wouldn't necessarily culture along the way, but they would be measuring gas production all throughout the small intestine. And that way you can get a reading the whole way down the small bowel. And that is probably going to be the future of SIBO at some point. It's probably a good 5 or 10 years away from being like available to the masses, but it is really neat. They do have that in research studies now. But anyway, so the location where you sample from is one big issue. The other thing is that aspirate testing has a really high incidence of contamination. Like 20% of the time you get contamination from the oral pharyngeal microbiome. So basically when they're putting the tube down your throat, they accidentally get some of the bacteria from your mouth or your throat on that sample. So it's not purely a sample coming from the small bowel. They think that happens about 20% of the time. So again, there's all these issues, but one that I want to highlight too is that the quantity of bacteria that we define as SIBO is still very, very, very up for debate. And that's probably the single biggest problem I see with aspirate testing, aside from the location issue, is that some research studies define SIBO as more than, it's like 10 to the third power CFU per ml, which is pretty low. Some say 10 to the fifth power, which is 100 times more bacteria. That's the cutoff that they would use for SIBO. Some of the older papers are using 10 to the sixth or 10 to the seventh. So it's kind of all over the place. But generally speaking, the bar is getting lower and lower and lower and lower to diagnose somebody with SIBO based on aspirate results, because they've lowered the quantity necessary to get that label from, again, like 10 to the sixth or seventh, down to 10 to the fifth, down to 10 to the third. And what we're starting to see too, that indicates that we're probably overdiagnosing it now, and that bar is in fact too low, is that when you get down that low, you start to not be able to tell the difference between healthy controls and people with SIBO. You start getting a lot of regular Joe Schmo people who are asymptomatic, and they have, Amy's on mute, but bless you anyway. You start getting a lot of people in the healthy control group who are getting told that they have SIBO based off of this criteria, which tells me that the bar is now way too low. But anyway, let's get out of the aspirate world for a moment.
And
go ahead.
I believe that would almost be similar. I mean, this is a weird analogy, but if you think of, you're trying to determine who is an alcoholic based on how many drinks they have a day. So let's say the standard, and I don't think this is an actual standard, so don't look this up, but like, let's say the standard was like 5 drinks a night is an alcoholic, versus maybe changing that barometer to 1 drink a night. If you had someone with 1 drink a night, that's the new standard. You're going to have way more quote unquote alcoholics than if the standard is 5 drinks a night or 3 drinks a night or whatever it is. Like, it can make a huge difference where you're having that cutoff and that barometer of what equates to SIBO and what isn't SIBO.
Yeah.
Such an interesting point, because again, the SIBO of SIBO's past is
much different.
There's almost going to be some sort of diagnosable major issue in a lot of those older cases, which again is so fascinating and such a good point. I've never really seen that discussed outside of you bringing it up to me with your deep dives. Because again, I think you throw out some of these discussions in the functional medicine space of like, SIBO causes malabsorption, SIBO causes all these things, and it's like, well, what
not at
is
10
even
to the third? CFU.
Right. So like what even is like maybe SIBOs of SIBO's past does, but not again, drinking 1 drink a night might not lead to any dysfunction, whereas drinking 5 or 6 drinks a night does.
Yeah.
And it's a huge difference. And so again, it's almost similar to something like that. Like you can't have them be equal in looking at a condition and having them be equul.
Yeah.
And thinking the same things are going to be happening.
Well, yeah, that actually is a good point. So if we go with your analogy of the alcoholic thing and like what criteria we use to define an alcoholic, if you want to do a research study showing whether or not alcoholics have an increased risk of heart disease, for example, you're going to get wildly different data depending on how you define alcoholic. If you do a study like that and you define alcoholism as 5 drinks a night or more, you're going to get one data set. If you lower the bar to one drink a night or more, then you're going to get wildly different data. And this is where, again, you're probably not going to get a very stark contrast between healthy, normal people and those people who are having 1 drink a night. And that's where, again, we start getting into the SIBO topic. You start seeing very similar rates of positive and negative results between the healthy, normal people and the people who have intestinal symptoms. You start seeing less and less of a positive response to things like rifaximin and antibiotic therapy because, again, a lot of the people who are told they have SIBO, in fact, do not have SIBO. And it makes me wonder, before we even get into breath testing here, it makes you really wonder because how many people have we met and how many people have we worked with who are coming in saying, oh, I have SIBO and here's my breath test or here's my whatever test, but the antimicrobials aren't working. I tried rifaximin 3 times and I'm still sick. And the doctor just says that this is really difficult to treat. Maybe SIBO's not that hard to treat, you guys. Maybe a lot of you just don't have SIBO. Right? Like, we have to acknowledge that's the reality
Mic
here.
drop.
Yeah. Well, and before I maybe go off on that bold statement too much more, let's rewind to why I even say that, because I know that's going to be something that's really frustrating and confusing for a lot of people to hear. So why I wanted to preface the conversation with the limits of aspirate testing is because most of the research that we have looking at the accuracy of breath testing is comparing breath testing to the so-called gold standard. But if the gold standard kind of sucks, and if the numbers, if the criteria is all over the frickin' place, we actually don't have a gold standard to compare to. And that's the problem. So you could have one study that's comparing lactulose breath testing versus aspirate, and they use the 10 to the 5th cutoff. You could have another study that's looking at lactulose testing versus the 10 to the 3rd cutoff. You could have another study that's comparing it to glucose testing or the gas sensing capsule. It's just all over the place. But when you read these like big meta-analyses or you look at these studies, you look at the sensitivity and specificity of breath testing and you start thinking it's not too bad, right? Like depending on what substrate is used, you start seeing specificity in the 80-ish% range, which isn't half bad, which would suggest that there's not a lot of false positives. And you get sensitivity. Sensitivity varies a little bit more depending on the substrate, but you see sensitivity results that are kind of hit and miss. And that makes you think, okay, false negatives are probably a much bigger deal. But again, it's what are we comparing it to when we compare it to aspirate? The thing is, up until I did this deep dive, I didn't know that there was an alternative to compare it to. Because again, everybody says that this is the gold standard, aspirate and culture. There's a handful of studies that I highlighted in this little project of mine where they compare breath testing with scintigraphy, which is basically where when you drink the lactulose or the glucose, they put in a radioactive isotope into that drink. And as you drink it down, they could trace the radioactive isotope through its journey throughout your GI tract. So they can tell based on this imaging, the scintigraphy, they could tell if that radioactive isotope and the lactulose is in the esophagus, the stomach, the upper part of the small bowel, the lower part of the small bowel, or if it reached the colon. And basically what they've done in these studies, they do this. So they give you the radioactive isotope, you drink down the lactulose or glucose, and they do the breath testing. So you would do a breath sample every 15 minutes, and they do a scintigraphy image every 15 minutes along the way, so that way they could compare the two. And they keep doing that until they see the radioactive isotope make it to the cecum, which is the first part of the colon. And when the substrate makes it to the colon, any subsequent rise in breath hydrogen or methane, you look at that and you're like, oh, well, the lactulose made it to the colon. We know for a fact that there's a crap load of bacteria, pun intended, in the colon. Therefore, it's not surprising that the gas production increased, because this is just normal colonic fermentation. And that's the measurement of what they call oral cecal transit time. So that's the time it took for that substrate to make it from the mouth to the cecum. Well, when they do this with breath testing and they're measuring along the way, there was one study in particular that used lactulose. And when they did this, they found that 88% of the time, the peak in breath gases was preceded by the arrival of the substrate in the dang colon, which suggests very strongly that up to or right about 88% of lactulose positive breath tests are in fact false positives. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Right.
Oh, it's just, and what's wild, Amy, what's wild, and I understand, but I don't understand. Lactulose breath testing has been used for many decades, and you know what it was used for? To measure oral cecal transit time. And then somebody somewhere decided, nah, we're going to use it for something else. And then everybody just went along with it for some reason. Everybody's going along with this and hopping on the SIBO bandwagon for some God unknown reason. But, honestly, I should do a little archaeological dig. I should go on PubMed and find the very first research article that uses lactulose testing for SIBO, so I could pin the blame on one research group. Because just, again, historically, they would do the lactulose breath test, and if they see the peak in breath gases at 62 minutes, they'd be like, oh, okay, that's your oral cecal transit time, 62 minutes. And now in this current day and age, you see a peak at 62 minutes, and everybody's going, oh, you have SIBO! Whoa!
Right.
How did we get to this place? It's just beyond me. And I hate to be kind of a conspiracy theorist here, but, to go back to your analogy of the alcohol kind of criteria, similarly.
I like we're riding this wave. We're riding this alcohol wave.
We are. Yeah, we're going to run with it. Well, another one, though, that's very analogous, I think, is the definition of high cholesterol used to be 240. Then, at some point years ago, they dropped it down to 220. And you know what happened? A lot more people qualified for cholesterol-lowering medications. How about that? Then, years later, they decided that that wasn't adequate, and they dropped it down to 200. None of this is based on research, by the way. If you get into the high cholesterol research and the link with heart disease research, it is wild. Because again, it's not founded in science whatsoever. I swear to God, it's all money. So you have, again, to sound like a conspiracy theorist, I don't have my tinfoil hat with me right now, but I wish I did. Drug companies, I think, are largely influencing this and dropping the criteria, say for cholesterol medication, so that more and more people qualify to get, or more and more people need cholesterol lowering medication, when in fact, there's barely any research to support the idea that high cholesterol leads to heart disease or stroke or heart attack. So similarly, here we have, I know for sure there are some researchers with pretty strong industry ties, and we have companies that make antibiotics that are being marketed very heavily for SIBO. And it just makes you wonder if we're going this direction.
Companies that make breath tests too. You know, you have
Yeah.
companies
Oh,
coming out of the woodwork that are doing breath
yes.
testing, you know.
Yes. And yeah, and as a side note, a lot of people will cite the North American consensus on breath testing. When you look at that, oh my gosh, every single person on that consensus has direct industry ties that would make them heavily biased. The majority of them have direct ties to either Commonwealth Labs, which is a breath testing company, or the company that makes rifaximin.
Yeah.
Both of those companies, especially, would heavily profit from the overuse of breath testing and the over prescribing of rifaximin. Like, how is this so effed up is beyond me. But anyway,
Right.
you know, again, not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, even though I know I do. I really wonder if a lot of the direction of the SIBO stuff is going that way because there are companies that stand to profit heavily from the overuse of breath testing, the overconfidence in breath testing, or the overzealous prescribing of things like rifaximin.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because sometimes it isn't even nefarious. There can just be bias. Like when you work for a corporation or something, or you're working in a specific way, or you have connections to rifaximin or whatever, you're just naturally probably going to be biased in ways that could affect research. And again, it's hard to fathom that there's that many conflicts of interest with some of these consensus. But again, I don't think it's unusual. I think if you go and look at heart disease, there's going to be all these conflicts of interest in people that are on the boards that are going to be lowering the threshold of what constitutes high cholesterol. It's
It's a systemic problem.
it
with
really
conventional
is.
medicine.
It really is.
I
And
would say conventional medicine and research.
yeah, and I think the frustrating part about the breath tests too is just sometimes when providers are ordering it over and over and over again, instead of responding to how the person is reacting to interventions, they're just saying, well, we need to, they're living and dying by this test
Yes.
that might not even be accurate or being interpreted properly. And that's the most frustrating part. And that's what keeps people stuck spinning their wheels in the SIBO paradigm, because you have some practitioners that will retest after every round of treatment. And again, like they'll have people doing rounds of treatment and not seeing any benefit just because the breath test said a certain thing. And again, the breath test might not be accurate, or they're misinterpreting it, or they might have fast orocecal transit time, and that's leading to a rise in hydrogen earlier on than maybe someone else. And so it's a mess. I don't know how because people like the testing. It's such a hard, I think where it becomes hard is, okay, so you eliminate the breath test as a part of the equation. Like what's the next
left?
solution? And there really isn't a great solution. Every solution has a bit of challenges to it. So, you know, for a while, and I think people can see some of the limitations of the breath test and they just say it's the best we have and we're just going to go with it. But some of the limitations are huge. It's not something to just go with.
Well, that's the thing. It's not like, oh, you know, it's not perfect, but it's the best we have. And we know that maybe 10 or 20% of people get a false positive. No, like again,
Right.
88% of lactulose breath testing that was positive was a false positive in that study. Now, similarly, same problem happens with glucose. Let's quickly cover that, and then we can talk more broadly, I guess. There is this, I don't know if I want to call it a rumor. There's this dogma in this belief in the SIBO community, both on the part of practitioners and patients, that glucose doesn't reach the terminal small intestine because it's readily absorbed in the proximal small intestine, and therefore glucose testing will lead to false negatives because it won't be able to diagnose distal SIBO, right? We've all heard that before. Nay, mind-boggling. Everybody who makes that claim is doing so off of the same damn research article, I swear to God, from 1972. Science has progressed, people. We have PubMed at our fingertips. Go read something, for crying out loud. But everybody's saying, oh, glucose is readily absorbed by the first part of the small intestine and it's never going to reach the last part of the small intestine. So false negatives with SIBO testing that uses glucose. No, we have a lot of research actually that shows that glucose can and does make it to the distal ileum and the colon. And similarly with the lactulose study that I cited, there's some research where they did glucose breath testing with scintigraphy, and they found in that cohort 48% of glucose tests that were positive were erroneously so. There were 48% false positives with glucose, specifically because the glucose made it all the way to the freaking colon. So no more of this conversation of distal SIBO and false negatives with glucose. It's a bunch of malarkey. Apparently, glucose breath testing also has false positives. Now, if I were to hedge my bets on one or the other, from a number standpoint, would I rather take lactulose or glucose? I guess I would take glucose because at least you have a 50-50 crapshoot of having an accurate positive diagnosis versus lactulose. You're almost guaranteed to have a false positive. So, if you're going to do one or the other, I guess glucose comes out superior. But I really don't think we have to worry about this whole false negative with glucose idea nearly as much as we think we do.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. It brings me, you know what? It reminds me of this client I had. She was maybe mid-20s. It was in the pandemic, so she was living at her parents, and we had been doing she had a positive breath test for whatever that actually means. She had a positive breath test, and we worked a lot on digestive capacity. We worked a lot on brain gut axis stuff, diversifying her diet. She was a really interesting one because she didn't like to put in a ton of effort, a ton of forced effort with diversity building. She would just eat whatever her parents made. That was her way of incorporating more diversity without overthinking it. She was just going to eat a little bit of whatever her parents made and build from there. But she was feeling amazing. No bloating. Bowel movements were great. She had a lot of bloating when we first started, a lot of symptoms when we first started. Felt amazing. Decided to do a follow-up breath test. So you know where this is going. She did a follow-up breath test. Well, the numbers were higher. And so she emails me in a panic and is oh my God, the SIBO's back. It's worse than before. What do I do? Do I ignore it? I'm feeling really good still. I don't know what to do. And we had a session and I just told her, we need to go by how you're feeling and not adjust based on this test that we don't even know is accurate. And it makes me wonder a little bit too, because I have seen sometimes people who have had worse numbers, or their numbers change. Maybe they have a treatment or whatever, and then their numbers get worse. What if it's changing their orocecal time? What if the treatment changes their orocecal time and makes it higher earlier or something, or makes the numbers bigger, and you're moving that substrate through the gut so much more quickly? And it may be that versus you having more bacteria, or the bacteria didn't respond and is worse after treatment. There's so many questions like that. And I see that often where people will go, I need to hit it harder. And it makes you want to shake them. You're like,
Panic.
No, you're doing fine. You're progressing. You could be digging yourself into a bigger hole by continuously beating this to death with antimicrobials based off this test that might be telling you a totally different thing, that your oral cecal time's changing versus you having more bacteria post treating the SIBO or post intervention of whatever you're doing. And again, you and I see on a daily basis practitioners just doing test after test after test with the breath test. And it's scary a bit because it's being so misused and abused at times. And again, I could see a provider maybe doing like an initial breath test, but it gets a little dicey when you're living and dying by it too.
Well, this goes back to our episode Test Don't Guess, right? Mm-hmm. So I forget what number that was now. I could look it up, but we did a whole episode Test Don't Guess, and the whole thing about that episode was this idea of living and dying by a test and trusting a test over your own body.
Yeah.
And I think that's problematic. Honestly, even recently, I was talking with my students in FODMAP Freedom, and somebody asked me if I recommended the Oura Ring because I have an Oura Ring.
Right.
And they were like ready to buy it pretty much. And I said, honestly, I don't recommend it. I don't feel like it's given me that much information. And it's kind of a neat thing to play with as a nerd who does this for a living. But there have been a fair amount of days where I wake up dead as a doornail, no energy. And I feel like I slept like crap. And then the Oura Ring says my sleep was good, or vice versa. And I know people, my mom in particular, my mom had a Fitbit. I don't know if she still does, but she would look at her Fitbit sleep data first thing in the morning. And she would say things like, oh, I felt like I slept pretty good, but my Fitbit said that I didn't. And I've been tired all day. And it's like, why are you going to do that to yourself?
Right.
Right? Like, why are you going to have that like placebo-ish kind of response and freak yourself out over nothing? If you wake up feeling good and energized, just run with it. Maybe you could use it in the opposite direction to brainwash yourself in a good way. Like on a day that you have bad energy, you could look at your Fitbit and see that you actually slept pretty good. And then maybe that would make you feel more energized.
Right.
And it would be a good brainwashing. But this idea that we can trust objective testing more than our own perception is ridiculous. But I think the bigger concern for probably more of our people is, what about the people who are symptomatic? What about the people who do have bloating and postprandial fullness and pooping problems and pain and IBS, and they're looking for answers so that they can understand what's going on? Like that's the group of people that I'm concerned about, because understandably they want answers and they want to understand what's going on so that they can feel better and they can address the root cause of their problems. And it's understandable that somebody in that position would want to do testing. But again, like lactulose, in my opinion, is off the table because 88% false positive rate is just so much worse than I'm willing to entertain. And then glucose being a 50-50 crapshoot, and glucose being either blatantly contraindicated or at least frowned upon, in my opinion, for anybody who has diabetes, hypoglycemia, any sort of blood sugar issues, or any hint of candida issues. I don't think it's safe for those people to do glucose testing, because you're either going to send your blood sugar to the moon and back, or you're going to feed the candida and give yourself a candida infection. And I say that because I did it to myself once, from specifically a glucose-based SIBO breath test.
Yeah.
So it's like, how many of our people have blood sugar problems, right? Maybe half. So glucose testing is automatically off the table for that subset of IBS patients. Then you have the group where it's questionable if they have candida, and that hacks out another solid chunk of these people. And then the people that you maybe entertain the thought of doing glucose breath testing on, now that group of people, you're going to get a 50-50 crapshoot as to whether or not the positive result is actually accurate. I'm unimpressed.
Yeah. You know, where does someone go is such a good question when they do have symptoms. And I just don't think we have a test that can totally like tell you exactly what's going on, unfortunately.
currently.
And so what do you do then? I mean, there could be some blood work and some other tests that could help guide interventions, but again, what I've found with working with clients, the more qualitative data I can gather, the better. So the more that I can understand how their symptoms present, what things have worked historically, what's going on in their life, what are they eating, are they too restrictive, have they taken antibiotics recently? Like those sorts of questions to me have provided way more value in helping someone find solutions that actually work versus running breath tests or doing tests probably in general. Granted, again, there are some really great tests that can provide some good data points, but I would say more often than not, I typically think qualitative data is much more helpful to me at this point than quantitative data that you might get from a breath test or some other sort of functional style testing. Although I guess breath test isn't really a functional medicine test, but it's used a lot more heavily there.
Well, you want to hear something funny, by the way?
Yes, I do.
Knock, knock. No, I'm kidding.
Okay.
So one of the things that I hear moderately frequently, and I see in like the SIBO IBS forums, is people will complain that they went to their GI doctor, they asked for a SIBO breath test, and the GI doctor said no, and they refused to order the SIBO breath test. And people get all in a snit. Again, understandably, you're frustrated, you don't feel good, you want answers, you don't know how bad the breath testing actually is. I totally get your side of things. But people will get all in a snit and they get pissed off at their GI doctor like they're some close-minded asshole who just wants them to suffer. And it's like, no, guys, the GI doctor is right here. They don't order SIBO breath testing because they understand how inaccurate it actually is. They would rather prescribe you a round of rifaximin and see what happens and treat empirically than do a waste of test and have you spend $200 and go through the pain in the butt testing process just to get erroneous results. And honestly, I respect them so much for that. So I applaud the GI doctors who won't order this bullshit test. I'm raising my eyebrow at the dang naturopaths and the functional doctors and the integrative doctors who run it on every gosh darn patient and rerun it all day, every day.
Right.
Those
And
are
on
the people who are
patients,
problematic.
on the patients that don't have gut symptoms too. That's what
That's
blows
even
my
worse.
mind. Right. That's what blows my mind. I just had a discovery call with someone who basically said that they didn't have any gut symptoms. They they had brain fog and depression that they were kind of trying to sort out with the functional provider. Well, the functional provider did a whole bunch of tests. SIBO breath test positive, look out. And so she did the antibiotics. She said the antibiotics, like she had anxiety like you wouldn't believe that came out of nowhere post antibiotics. And then she had undigested stool. She had all these weird stool problems that came up post the
Because you took an
rifaximin.
antibiotic.
Right. So, and then, so it's wild to me. Those are the most wild cases where people go to functional providers with maybe a hormone problem or, I don't know.
Or something
a problem.
neurological, like brain
Right.
fog, depression, anxiety kind of stuff.
Right. Something like that. And then, all disease starts in the gut mentality, which, maybe it's a factor in the depression and the fog or whatever. I don't know. Maybe it is, but don't just obliterate the gut with an antibiotic without any symptoms. And again, do this test that's not accurate. I don't know. That's wild to me.
Going back to, unfortunately, I'm pretty sure we brought this up in the Test Don't Guess episode, but I'll say it again. Honestly, a big selling point and a big marketing point for functional medicine is the idea that we can order these fancy tests that your regular old doctor can't. And you, poor lowly peasant, you don't have access to this testing. You can't order a GI map, but I can. Well, I can't because they took away my account, but that's another story for another day. But you can't order a breath test, but I can. And then I have the magical superpower to interpret these fancy tests for you. That is a really big selling point to not only get providers into the field of functional medicine, but once you put your shingle up and you're marketing yourself and trying to get patients to come in the door as a functional medicine provider, probably the number one tool at your disposal in that case is to market the crap out of the testing. And, you know, in that way, we talked about this briefly on Marco Polo. I'm kind of bracing myself for the comment section on these videos that I put together. I read like 40 plus research articles on this topic, really did the deepest of deep dives, like 30 plus pages of research compiled from those articles. And I'm shaking in my boots a teeny bit. A, because I think people are going to be frustrated that they felt like crap for a long time and all their testing was normal. Doctors said that they were cuckoo. It was all in their head. They finally got a positive test result. They finally felt like they had an answer. And now I'm the big meanie pie who's taking away that answer that they were so happy to have. So there's that element. I think that some consumers, some like normal people, are going to be really upset. But also, I'm wondering if the functional medicine mob is going to come after me again, like the GI map videos that I did, because in your words, I'm shitting on their Bible. Right? Like, if we can't lure people in the door with the GI map, then how are we going to get patients? If we can't lure people in the door with fancy SIBO breath testing, how are we going to get patients? I don't know, guys. Figure it out, man. Like, start a YouTube channel. That was good for me, like getting my name out there. People find me now on YouTube. I don't know what to tell you, but don't market these tests and don't rely on these tests that actually don't tell you jack shit.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know how someone would be able to argue thoroughly against what you said just because it was so well researched and you have all the receipts. You have all the receipts with the articles and stuff. I don't know how someone could really come at you, but I mean, people will probably maybe try, but
well, people of the internet be weird, first of all.
People of the internet will be a little weird at times, and you're probably going to run into some crackhead Steve who's going to be yelling obscenities at your video.
Yeah.
The breath test is the greatest thing ever.
You know what I did though? And I forget, I think I told you this. Because I know some people are going to get defensive and not want to like come over to the side of the SIBO conversation. I put out an open invitation at the end of each of the 3 videos and said, if you want to fact check me, by all means. And I made a Google Drive link with every single research article, the full PDF of every single research article, and all of my Word documents with quotes and highlighting and whatnot, and the full copy of my PowerPoints. So if people want to fact check me and go to town and read the exact articles that I read, by all means. And if you come to a different conclusion than I did, you know, by all means, like comment on my videos and tell me about it, because I probably will be moderating the comments for some time.
Yeah.
But, you know, I've read these articles and this was the conclusion I came to. And I don't know if I know the way forward from, you know, the research kind of point of view. I think that we're kind of stuck in a weird time where SIBO's just going to be wicked overdiagnosed, both in the clinical setting and the research setting. And the SIBO machine is going to keep moving forward. Honestly, though, in a weird way, what I think is a way forward for the people listening to this episode, by all means, go ahead and treat SIBO. Just treat it with everything but antimicrobials and restrictive diets and see where you get. Right. So we did a whole episode moderately recently about overcoming SIBO without antimicrobials. Go watch that video. I have a similar video on my channel. Go do all the stuff that we talk about in those videos. Work on motility. take some prokinetics, work on digestive capacity, HCl, bile, work on your gut-brain axis and your vagus nerve and your sleep and your stress. Think about, what does the nervous system need to be happy and healthy? Blood sugar, movement, stimulation, blood flow, go about it in the most holistic way possible. And if you still want to keep the framework of SIBO to guide you, there's a whole world of stuff you could do that doesn't involve starving and killing the SIBO. Do those things and see how far you get. And it's up to you at the end of the day if you want to free yourself from the label of SIBO or if you want to remain shackled to this idea of bacterial overgrowth. But at the bare minimum, in my mind, you no longer have to be shackled to the idea of killing and starving the damn thing. Because even if you were one of the, 12% or 52% of people with a positive test that was a genuine positive test, even if you're in that, between the totality of the two breath tests, even if you're in that minority and you have a true positive test result, we don't have a ton of good evidence that starving the SIBO actually works anyway. So base your nutrition off of whatever's going to keep you healthy and maybe takes the edge off of your symptoms and manages your symptoms. And if you want to tackle SIBO in every other way possible, and then maybe if all of that you get limited response from, then if you want to trial a little bit of berberine or a little bit of oregano, not like Alison Seebeck or Mecca dosing, I'm talking like normal human being amounts of the stuff, you could certainly try it. There are going to be people who have bacterial overgrowth out there. I just don't think we should be leading with killing and starving of the stuff. As a side note, by the way, on that topic, there was one article, I think it was with glucose testing, if I remember correctly, but I could be wrong. They did the breath testing with scintigraphy. So they were monitoring where the stuff was all the way down the tube. And they were diagnosing SIBO based off of that. So if the breath gas production peaked before the arrival of the substrate in the cecum, then they labeled those people as having SIBO. If the breath peak happened after the arrival of the substrate in the cecum, then they were SIBO negative, right? Because that's normal colon fermentation. They then took these people, all of whom had IBS, and they were all symptomatic. They took the people who had SIBO based off of the scintigraphy study. They took those people, and I think it was like 35% of the SIBO negative cohort, and they gave them rifaximin. And guess what? Only the people with SIBO actually responded to rifaximin. The people with IBS who were SIBO negative based on scintigraphy, not much response.
Yeah.
So, the people who have true, honest to goodness, positive SIBO test results could respond positively to antimicrobials. And it might be something that you incorporate later on, but it wouldn't be something I lead with. I would work on the motility, the nervous system, the gut-brain axis, the digestion. I would do all of that first and then maybe get into that.
Right. It would almost be a setting the stage. If you do need antimicrobials, you want to set the stage by addressing any factors that are going to lead to getting the microbiome into a better state, creating environmental factors that balance out the microbiome to begin with.
Yeah.
Again, if you start right from a microbial front and throw a bomb down there, but you have horrible motility, poor digestion, it's not going to take hold very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost, to me, again, this question of I think we've talked about it in the past where SIBO, what underlies probably most SIBO in this day and age would be dysbiosis. So doing things that will generally help with dysbiosis would probably help with people that are being overdiagnosed with SIBO. And again, I think there could be a percentage of the population where some pruning makes sense, but not 5 rounds, not continuing to do rounds after round when you're not seeing results.
Yeah.
Again, that's the limit. If you've tried a round and didn't really get much, I don't think I would continue on that path. Again, maybe try one other thing if you are going to do something, but I just had a patient more recently too, where, you know, it's the cycle of testing, treating with her doctor. And she's feeling a lot better. But then her doctor's using the breath test to then say, we need to keep treating. And it's like, well, I don't even really think you got much benefit out of the last round. And she agreed with me. But yeah, that's where it gets extremely frustrating, when it's pushing through and jamming this popular SIBO idea that you have to just destroy everything in there, obliterate it to death before you're going to see results, when in reality, focusing on all these other things that create a more hospitable environment for good guys and a less hospitable environment for bad guys is going to be maybe what leads to way more symptom reduction than even doing killing and clearing and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, you touched on something that I want to mention too. Possibly one kind of starting point, one indication for people to go off of is whether or not they've had any positive response from antimicrobials before. Because I've seen a lot of these people where, again, they're told, oh, SIBO's really hard to treat. And, oh, you have a really bad case of SIBO, because they don't get much responsiveness from antimicrobials. But if you try one antibiotic or one antimicrobial and you really don't feel any better, or heaven forbid you feel worse, I'm automatically going to be super skeptical of the boogeyman overgrowth model for you. Then, if you do try a second round of critter killers, whether they be prescription or natural, I'm ultra skeptical. And I honestly, I don't advise my patients to do more than that. If you try, Xifaxan and you get nothing, and then you try, oregano or berberine or something natural and you get nothing, don't keep hammering the snot out of the same line of thinking. What is the quote that's always attributed to Einstein, and I've never fact checked it?
Oh yeah, like if you
insanity,
do this,
insanity,
doing the same thing,
doing the same thing, expecting a different result is the definition
doing the
of
same
insanity.
thing over and over again,
Yeah.
and expecting a different result.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I remember I had a conversation like this with a patient a while back. This was maybe 2 years ago. And in retrospect now, I think she had a lot of health OCD. And there was a lot of just kind of frantic desperation kind of energy, and probably, more of that sort of stuff that we could have worked on specifically. But I remember she was convinced that she had SIBO. I don't remember if she had a positive test or not, but she was utterly convinced that she had SIBO. And so, we tried her on an antimicrobial blend that I think works pretty well. So I had her do the Dysbiocide FC-Cidal combo from Biotics Research. And then we touched base maybe 2 weeks later, and she really wasn't feeling any different. And I explained to her that this lowers my confidence in the idea that she has SIBO, and that we probably need to pivot and do other things instead of antimicrobials. And she got really panicky with me and kind of backtracked, was like, oh, well, no, I made it sound like I wasn't feeling better, but I think I'm actually feeling a little bit better. So if it's okay with you, I want to continue it for a little while longer. Is that okay? I'm like, all right. Like, you literally just told me you feel no different whatsoever, and now you're changing your tune because you're terrified. Okay. We touch base another 2 weeks later at the end of it. And again, and she's like grasping for straws. She's like, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I'm feeling better. And I'm like, how do you feel better? Like, what's improved? She couldn't describe it. She was just like, yeah, I think I'm feeling better. Yeah, it's definitely SIBO. And I'm just like, you're making shit up, dude. I didn't tell her that, but I was like, you're making shit up. You are just freaking out that I'm taking away the promise of this being SIBO because you've been sold on the idea that you just kill it and then you move on with your life. And we maybe tried one other round of something, and shocker, it did basically nothing for her. And, at that point, honestly, we parted ways. because there was this disconnect. Like, she was very desperate to kill and starve and obliterate the thing, and I wasn't convinced that the thing was actually there. And the things that she really needed to work on, she just wasn't super open-minded to working on at the time. But that's an example where, people, this carrot is dangled in front of you, and you think, ooh, it's SIBO, and if I could just kill it and starve it, I could move on with my life and be a normal person, and I could feel good. Hooray, I have an answer. But by the way, you're muted, my dear. I just realized, I think you said yup or something.
Okay.
But,
Sorry.
But, like, if you try one or perhaps two antimicrobials and you don't feel notably different or notably better, it's probably not SIBO. Or if it is, even if you have SIBO, the overgrowth of the bad stuff is probably taking a back seat to something else.
Right.
But you need to listen to your body versus the people who do take an antimicrobial and it's like, the world is brighter and my brain works and like literally everything about my existence is better now. Maybe those are the people who have a genuine positive result on breath testing.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up a couple things that are interesting. This idea of you going to the doctor and them saying you have this bad case of SIBO, or SIBO's super hard to treat. I mean, that mentality just plants some really weird seeds in people's heads too, where it feels like an uphill battle and they have to throw bombs down there in order to make progress, which just isn't the case. Again, I've seen people with really gnarly symptoms not respond at all to antimicrobials and respond, again, a majority probably of my clients don't respond to antimicrobials. Again, there are some people that do, like you said, which is great. I'm not against antimicrobials. They're just so willy-nilly and abused. I will say too, when you're talking about your client that had that more desperate type energy, historically for me personally, during my gut issues, I always made the worst decisions when I was desperate and frantic.
Yep.
So if you feel as though you have a desperate, frantic, urgent energy about you, try to just take a step back a little bit, maybe focus on something else for a month or so, because again, with gut issues, usually there's so much complexity. Most people aren't going to get a huge benefit from something in a week. Again, there are some people that might take rifaximin and the skies part and they can finally see the sun again. But again, there's a lot of people that don't get that experience. And again, if you feel as though you will and you don't, that can be really devastating too. And it can set you back if it wasn't the right solution for you, especially if you're doing round after round after round. But yeah, again, just being cognizant of how you're moving through your journey is really helpful because, like I said, with clients and in my own experience, I always made the worst decisions when I was desperate or urgent. And again, it's hard because we all want to feel better. There's nothing wrong with that. But definitely the degree of urgency equals poor decision making half the time, or again, rushed decision making, and doesn't allow to really see foundational pieces too. A lot of times your horse blinders are on, you can't see the forest through the trees, and that can just get you in a lot of trouble gut wise.
I think that when you're in that really desperate, clamoring, frantic kind of mode, and again, it's understandable how you get there if you don't feel good. I do get it. And again, like the functional medicine world and like social media influencers, a lot of them weave a lot of fear mongering and a lot of really desperate, like you're doomed kind of energy into their content online. So we live in a world that really fuels that in people, let alone if you had a little bit of a predilection to go that direction to begin with. But yeah, this is a well-studied thing when you're frantic or desperate or frazzled, you make poor decisions. And this is where you start getting people, going on the Facebook groups and desperately seeking answers in the Facebook groups. And you get the people who like go to their doctor and they want a breath test, and then the doctor won't run it. And they're like, I have to get it somewhere else. And then they like order it from some third-party website or something. And they're not critically thinking about, wait, maybe there's a reason why the GI doctor refused to run this test. And maybe I need to think about this a little bit more critically, right? So I think that's a good point. I think maybe even a starting point, even before you get to the, all the ways that you could treat SIBO, quote unquote, without antimicrobials, maybe even before that, just taking an inventory of your mental health and your energy and how you're approaching this journey, and possibly taking a break for a month.
Yeah.
I had a friend who was going through a health issue, and she was very desperate, very frantic, a lot of health OCD stuff going on. And I actually suggested to her, well, and it was right around the holidays too. And I was like, why don't you just take a break from all the stuff? Why don't you just do these core couple of things that actually help you so you don't lose momentum? And what if you just took like a month to get through the holidays, enjoy the holidays as much as you can? No new supplements, no new tests, no new herbs, no new doctors. What if you just kind of take a breather? And you would have thought I told her to light her eyebrows on fire. Absolutely out of the question. How dare I suggest that? And don't you know how hard this is for me? And it was a really big rift for us to try to get through. But I'll use this analogy. If you're thinking that way, and if you're thinking the idea of just taking a break from this journey is a ludicrous idea, so I haven't gotten super into proper meditation, right? Like I'm not currently sitting on a cushion with my legs crossed and saying Om and doing breath work and that sort of meditation. If I do something meditative or something for self-care, it's more of like painting or going on walks around the neighborhood and talking to Amy on Marco Polo or doing something like that, or watching my K-pop videos. But I don't do a ton of hardcore meditation.
Like structured.
Yeah. Type. Like I typically wouldn't say I'm going to go meditate. Right. So one of the things that I have said to myself over the years is, well, it's hard for me to meditate because my brain goes all over the place, right? I've got a little bit of the squirrel brain, and I'll sit there and focus on my breathing for like 5 breaths. And then my brain goes to, oh, did I upload that thumbnail for YouTube? Or, oh, I should text this person this. Or, oh, did I check the patient portal for messages from oh, did I send that email I thought I sent? And, oh, did I finally? And I start thinking of other stuff. And I remember I took a meditation class. I forget which one now because I've taken a few. But I took a meditation class, and that idea was brought up. And the instructor said, if you are one of those people who has a really hard time meditating and your brain kind of goes all over the place, you are exactly the person who needs this the most. I was like, ooh, calling me out. Okay. And it made me think about it, right? The thing that I'm using as an excuse to not do meditation is the exact symptom that tells me I should really meditate.
Right.
Similarly, if the idea of taking a break or slowing down the healing journey sounds ludicrous or scary or intimidating, or if you heard that and you were like, oh, I can't take a break. Oh my God, she doesn't get it. Maybe that's an indication that you are precisely the type of person who should take a break for a month or two. And you should kind of just gather yourself again, reevaluate where you're at, what your priorities are, what your goals are. And then you can go into it with a relatively fresh slate. And you can try to go into it with this new viewpoint of, again, maybe not killing and starving so much. Maybe you do everything but the killing and the starving. And then you use any antimicrobials, maybe as a finishing touch, the icing on the cake in your quote unquote SIBO journey, but you're not going to lead with these really aggressive therapeutic things, right?
Yeah, to me, it's so interesting because similar to what you're saying, if you're someone that's so freaked out to take a break, it almost is a bit diagnostic of like health anxiety in a way. Like you have to be doing something all the time or researching all the time, or it's a coping skill in some ways to keep pushing on even when you're not sure where to go and you're really tired and burdened by this particular issue. And again, for me, that would have been scary to take a break, but it's almost like an exposure in a sense of, oh, like it might be scary at first to take a break and take a step back, but in reality, it'll over time help your nervous system kind of die down a bit. It might ramp you up at first and it might be really scary to do, but I do think a lot of times it's what's necessary to just realize that there's more to life than, I don't know, there's more going on than just your gut issues. And a lot of times it feels like the gut issues is your whole life if you're that wrapped up and urgent with it. Or at least that's how I felt. The more urgent and frantic it was, everything else in your life fades into the background and all you're seeing is your gut issues. Whereas if you take a break and take a step back, it's scary, but then all these other things start to come more into frame and you can actually see that you have more things going on than just your gut issues. Maybe you have awesome family, you have some friends that you can hang out with. You can get back into a passion or hobby. Maybe you focus a little more on work. Like there's so many different elements.
You can catch up on sleep. You could eat some M&Ms. I don't know. You do you.
Right.
Yeah. And you know what's fascinating too, and again, I'm going to poke holes in this, just trying to see where people are at. So again, I think that when we bring up the idea of taking a break for a month or two, and then kind of
feels like
coming
we're
into
breaking
it
up.
fresh. Well,
too.
Oh my God, should we call this episode Breaking Up with SIBO?
Oh my God.
I don't know. The downside, I want to do it, but also the downside is if I reference this video in the future, I'm going to have a hard time finding it. So I might just have to name it something boring like SIBO breath tests.
Yeah.
But I want to call it Breaking Up with SIBO because that would be so good. But meeting people where they're at. Again, I think the idea of taking a break, a lot of people are going to get really panicky and think, oh my God, I can't, you don't get it. There's also maybe going to be some people who have this thought in their brain where they think, well, that might work for some people, but not for me because my symptoms are so bad. My situation is so severe that I can't afford to take a break. Right? Kind of, I've referred to this before as I'm special syndrome. We all have it. Some of us just have it worse than others. If you're feeling that special syndrome brain lesion kick in, I assure you more than likely that is not the case. One of the weirder parts of doing this work for a lot of years now is I have met people who are incredibly sick.
Right.
Like I'm talking, can't get out of bed, potentially for days or weeks on end, really debilitated. Like I'm picturing one patient right now, like POTS, like mold toxicity issues, fibromyalgia, just excruciating pain, passing out from the POTS. And she still is such a ray of sunshine when I get to talk to her. Like her attitude and her disposition, she's funny, she's nice. She's really thoughtful. She has a good perspective. She has a good bullshit detector. She doesn't fall for a lot of the malarkey out there. And she has a wonderful daughter who's now either in college or graduated college. And she has great relationships and she loves her community. And like, she's one of the sicker people I've ever worked with. And she has this great energy and this great attitude. And that I see people, and I don't mean to belittle people's experiences, but I see other people who frankly are not as sick. And you would think they were on death's door. And they're just shriveled up into a raisin, won't leave their house, but it's self-inflicted and they're suffering so much more than they need to. And so similarly, if you're having the thought of, well, that might work for other people, but not for me because my situation is special somehow, 90+% likelihood that that is incorrect. And I would invite you to still entertain the thought of taking a break. Again, having that thought kick in might also be diagnostic of the health OCD, health anxiety thing. And that might be another indicator light that you would highly benefit from letting go and just pausing this journey for a month or two. And again, gain that perspective, take the blinders off and see the forest for the trees again.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the person that you described, that your patient that has such a great attitude, even though she has debilitating symptoms, it's like she hasn't let the condition define her or rob her of the relationships, of community. She's stayed connected. And I think that that's what a lot of people fail to do at times, is they get really disconnected, but really hypervigilant of all the gut stuff. And so it does feel, the feelings of fear that you're experiencing and the level of urgency is terrifying. So again, like, this isn't anything easy to deal with, or like we're being flippant. Just take a break. It's like what you are experiencing if you have health anxiety, as someone who struggles with anxiety and OCD, is terrifying and it's very fearful. But fear doesn't necessarily equate to danger either. I don't necessarily think for most people taking a break is not dangerous, but in your head it can feel dangerous because there's a level of fear.
And part of it is the SIBO world, right? Mm-hmm. Of you have to kill, starve, starve, starve. Otherwise the SIBO is going to come back.
Right.
And if you feed it even a morsel of a lentil, it's going to come back in that, oh my God. And similarly, if you eat one crumb of sugar, you're going to feed the candida and that it's going to be winning and you're going to be losing. And oh my God, you're never going to recover from this. So again, there's a lot of that dialogue in the gut health space and in the functional medicine space. It's really bred into it. And again, I think that part of it is somewhat intentional on the part of my colleagues, because if we are able to scare you, you're going to be really compliant. And, that's really shitty. I don't have anything else to comment on, but that is a very real strategy that is used in the functional medicine space in particular. I think that conventional medicine scares you into compliance as well. Right. But yeah,
well, it's so interesting too. And I know that, again, not to beat this to death either, but I know we've talked about it before, and I've experienced it a decent amount with clients and stuff, where we'll get the frantic email like, I need to see you right now, or a new client who says, when can you get me in? I'm urgent. Like, again, we can see that almost with new clients or previous clients that want an appointment. And I think there can be some degree of urgency, like, hey, I had a flare up, like, when can you get me in? That I think is reasonable, but you do sometimes see this, again, the desperate, urgent emails in situations like that too. And it's so funny because, again, I just started working on OCD stuff with Jenna Overball, which we had on our podcast. She got licensed in Ohio, like, amazing and random. And I'm in Ohio, so I'm like, oh, I'm going to like have some sessions with her. And it was so funny. So we have been messaging and stuff on Instagram for a while. She started a business, so we were talking about like business stuff. And I saw she was trying to get her license in Ohio, but she was saying she was having trouble on Instagram. Licensure stuff can be annoying to deal with. So throughout time, like every month or so, I'd ask like, hey, did you get your Ohio license? I'd love to have a couple sessions with you. She was like, oh, no, not yet. So there was a couple months of that. And then finally, again, I asked her and she's like, oh yeah, I have my Ohio license. Like, I'd be happy to work with you. So we had a session here this week, our first session, and she was basically saying like, oh, it's like so nice to work with someone too that isn't urgent, like that a lot of her clients are very urgent, like it's an emergency, I need to help right now. She said my energy was like very low key, like love to work with you. Like she could just tell that there was less urgency, and she was saying she wasn't really taking on a ton of new clients, and she was just like, oh yeah, I'll definitely work with you, just because again there was less of that urgency type experience. Because I'd imagine for her too, being an OCD based therapist, you're going to have way more urgent anxiety, and I think I've come a long way too with some of that stuff, because it's something that I notice when it is coming on strong. What's creating this degree of urgency? Like, what's the fear there? Because I think historically I've had some of that, especially along my SIBO journey. But yeah, I think I just thought that was kind of interesting, because even she, I'm sure, sees it all the time.
Yeah. I'm sure in that profession in particular.
Right.
The good thing, at least for her practice, is that pretty much, I would think 100% of her patients come to her knowing that they have anxiety and OCD.
Right.
The challenge for us sometimes is that a lot of people come to us and they might know that they have anxiety, but they might not know that they have OCD. And then trying to basically point that out to somebody when you're not a mental health professional yourself can be a little bit challenging, because I think sometimes people come to us and they see us as like the diet and supplements and test people.
Right.
And they don't see us fitting into that box of mental health professional necessarily. So anyway, that could be a little bit challenging, but
yeah,
to kind of bring it back to testing. Oh, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say, like, one small thing about that too. Like, I think that one thing Jenna is really interesting about, and she pulls in other OCD experts on this, functionally, she argues that OCD and anxiety are on some spectrum. So it's not that OCD is wildly different than anxiety. They're both rooted in what if scenarios. Some might be more down to earth than than another person's, where like someone with OCD might think like, oh, I'm going to stab that person. Like, again, it's like wildly against their character.
Crackhead
So there
Steve.
so there could be more some things that could be a bit more wild in terms of the thoughts. But then again, there's also like relationship OCD, which is like, oh, do I really love my partner? Like again, it's more down to earth. I don't know. Like, do I love them enough to marry
more
that?
like real life scenarios.
Right.
I
right.
guess.
Or in health anxiety and OCD are, again, like, to me, are one and the same. And a lot of the interventions would work for both things. So like, not shying away from situations, not trying to avoid situations would be helpful, that kind of thing. So
yeah,
again, I think
like exposure therapy-ish stuff.
Right. That's, again, probably one of her biggest arguments, is that a lot of people with anxiety that are labeled with GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, would probably benefit more so from ERP than talk therapy, like digging really intensely
psychoanalyzing all the things.
Right, to the root of the anxiety versus like taking action and trying to, if you have social anxiety, go socialize, like taking baby steps to get there versus digging really deep into why you're that way, or using a bunch of coping skills, which basically just become compulsions. So it's an interesting argument. If you struggle with GAD or OCD, I'd highly recommend following Jenna Overball, because she's been helpful for me. And there's a lot of, if you're ever curious, people can reach out to me, because I have a lot of Instagram-y people that I follow that I typically like. I know we follow a few of the same ones, and some of them are dead on.
Oh, yeah. We message back and forth with things that are pretty apropos. We could probably even do an updated episode about health anxiety and health OCD down the road. Because we did that at the beginning of season 2, which feels like a long time ago, but
maybe
I guess
could
it wasn't.
Pull like Emma from Therapy in a Nutshell. Like, maybe we could pull someone else back to as a
or you
guest.
should reach out to your boy Anxiety Josh. See if you can get him on.
He's like my anxiety crush in a way, because he has an accent and he just seems so kind. Like, it's not like he's like drop dead gorgeous. I feel like he's cute, but he's very kind.
He's cute,
and
for sure.
he's cute. I don't think he's like drop dead gorgeous, you know? Like he's cute and has an accent and I like his content's very calming and soothing. He just has a very good
Let's start buttering up Anxiety Josh and see if we could get him on here, because I think that could be a good conversation.
Yeah.
But bringing it back around to
breath test?
SIBO testing, I know. I'm starting to question whether or not I can arguably name this one anything regarding breath testing, but I think that we can.
I think you can do like breath testing and other stuff, something like that.
Yeah, there we go. Again, really the executive summary of this conversation is that we don't have any reliable tools for diagnosis, right? Like some of you might have the energy right now of, I have to go make my GI doctor do an endoscopy and do an aspirate culture test. But again, that has problems too. And that gold standard, quote unquote, is probably not gold. It's bronze at best. And that's being very generous. Like I said, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, the gas sensing capsules are probably going to be the future of SIBO, but I think that they're still a ways away. And much to their chagrin, I highly doubt these are going to be available in functional practices. So I don't think the breath test is going to die out anytime soon, because the functional medicine people are still going to be using the breath tests, if nothing else. But, maybe GI offices could start using the gas sensing capsule when it becomes commercially available. In the research arena, some of the papers had very, very reasonable, solid recommendations for how to approach breath testing. So they basically said, if you're going to do breath testing, use glucose, use probably a 60-minute cutoff at the absolute maximum. That might even be generous, but absolute maximum cutoff, 60 minutes. Then for people who have a positive breath test with glucose using that criteria, those people should then be referred to doing another breath test with concomitant scintigraphy, which means you do the test at the exact same time. And that way, when there's a peak, you can discern if it came from the small bowel or the colon. So they basically these papers suggest using a glucose breath test as an initial screening tool, and then taking any positives and running them through another breath test with scintigraphy to confirm if that was a true positive or a false positive. That would be the ideal scenario. The thing is, I don't know how commercially available scintigraphy is. There's only a handful of papers that have really done this even. So I don't know if this is something that's widely available. If you ask your GI doctor to do it, I don't know if they're going to be capable of that, to be quite honest. So again, we're kind of between a rock and a hard place. Even if I told you the best method of testing, so again, gas sensing capsule or glucose breath test with concomitant scintigraphy. Even if we know the best possible testing, neither of those is widely available or really available, period, at this point. So we're really just left with the unsexy, unglamorous, listen to your body, listen to your symptoms and your experience, what makes it better, what makes it worse. Try to be as unbiased and objective as possible and really evaluate, is there a reason to believe that you have SIBO? Or have you been listening to the noise on the internet that's led you to believe that you have SIBO erroneously? If you think you have SIBO, honest to goodness, true, you feel it in your bones, you have SIBO, then again, entertain the thought of taking a break for a month or two. That'll help you get some clarity. It'll help you zoom out, take the blinders off, and you might start to recognize some things that you otherwise would not have seen. Then after that point, go refer to some of the work that we've done about overcoming SIBO without antimicrobials, or, I think that maybe in the episode just diagnosed what now. I think we might have talked about some of the stuff too, like getting back to the unsexy basics, go back to what does a human being need to be healthy? Right?
Yeah.
Don't think of nutrition for SIBO. Think of nutrition for human beings who want to be healthy. And, lifestyle and supplements for people who just want to be healthy. If you're just average Joe, Jane America, try to get some movement, get decent sleep, manage your stress, go outside, try to invest time into relationships that bring you joy. Maybe throw a multivitamin in and a vitamin D supplement for good measure if you're in a region of the world that would lead to vitamin D deficiency, for example. Make sure you're getting a lot of diversity in your diet. Look for any holes, vitamins, minerals, macros, calories, etc.
Right.
And then once you do all of that for months and you feel like you have a lot of your ducks in a row, if you're still symptomatic, then you might entertain the thought of doing a modest dose of an antimicrobial, dipping your toe in the water and seeing if you feel better. And if you do, great. You should have laid the foundation that now by the time you get to the antimicrobials, you should only need, a couple of weeks, one round, and then boom, you're done. And it doesn't need to be this ongoing chronic,
right.
Oh, this is difficult to treat kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's start to finish what I recommend you all do.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. Awesome advice.
All right. Well, acknowledging that this could be a very frustrating and bummer of an episode, I hope
We're
that
on your side. Let's just say
We
that
are.
too. We're on your side. We're rooting for you, but we personally, I made a lot of mistakes. You probably made mistakes in your journey. We see a lot of people making a bunch of mistakes, and it's frustrating on our end because we see practitioners in the SIBO space leading you astray a bit.
A bit. You're so kind.
Yeah. But again, we're rooting for you. We want you to succeed. It's not like we're just trying to be meanies. We want you
Not at
to
all.
improve.
And the symptoms you're experiencing are real and they totally suck. And we get how you've gotten to the point that you're at. But I would rather be truthful and scientifically accurate.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Okay, Armand's still here. Armand's like, "Can I go?" And she was crying in there, so I wasn't sure if he left.
We'll wrap up momentarily, Armand. Don't you worry.
I'm sorry.
But I was just saying, and I know that Amy feels the same way. I would rather be truthful and scientifically accurate and tell you the hard to hear truth in the hopes that you take that information and you can eventually reframe it and see it as something positive.
Right.
So again, you might be feeling like, oh my God, you took this thing away from me and now I don't know what to do. I'm back at square one. Nothing makes sense anymore. Nobody believes me why I'm sick. At least I had a label this time. Oh my God, oh my God. But again, if you take that breather, if you could take a little break, reframe this and see that a world of opportunity just opened up to you. You don't have to be shackled to this label. You don't have to be shackled to the idea of killing and starving. You can incorporate other things into your life and into your protocol, if you will, that actually stand a chance of getting you to feel better.
Right.
Instead of just hammering the snot out of this path that is probably not serving you. So hopefully you see it that way too. But all right, guys. We will see you in the next episode. Hopefully a little bit less depressing than this episode. I feel like we kept it light despite the topic.
Yeah.
Honestly, my YouTube videos are probably a little bit more depressing on this topic. Thorough, but depressing. But go check those out. Again, I do the deep dive on the literature. If you want to fact check me, go right ahead. I give you the links to all of that stuff. And we will see you right back here for another rip-roaring episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast, where we reframe everything you thought you knew about the gut.
We blow up the ideas that you think you know.
Hopefully in a good way, and we help you feel better soon.